I wanted to kick off Anarchy Night by talking about someone. I don't know whether people will make this link immediately, but hopefully in the next 5 minutes, the link will seem a good one to make, by talking about Jesus. Because I think Jesus was a kind of anarchist before the word. And I want to try and persuade you how. Anyone who says anything about Jesus disagrees with what everyone else has said about Jesus. He's one of these figures. So you can kind of freewheel around Jesus quite a lot if you want, and hope you don't offend too many people in the process. But let me see whether I can persuade you there might be some link or other. You know, if it were true, then our whole culture is premised, at least very indirectly, and now with distant interpolations on this figure. But there are signs that maybe he was, you know, in that same sort of strand of interventions in society, you might say, you know, wanting to stir things up, inject something new and different that was radical in the sense of reaching for the roots. And, you know, so if there's anything we know about Jesus is that, for example, he taught in parables and aphorisms. He's, you know, if you read any biblical scholarship, actually, this is quite remarkable. It's not other people are known to have taught in parables at the time. You know, things like the parable of the sower, parable of the Good Samaritan, all that. And yet, you know, if the biblical accounts stand for anything, it's that he did do that, because there's, I think, 40 or 50 parables that are attributed to him. So it's clearly the way he did things. And of course, parables are not obvious ways of teaching, especially when you might at first try to treat them as moral tales, which seems to work with the Good Samaritan. But then when you look at them in the total round, a lot of them are immoral, or amoral at least, about unjust judges and people getting paid the same regardless of when they went to work in the day and all sorts of things like that. So they don't settle easily. And so you start to wonder, what on earth is this figure driving at? Part of that, I think, is discerned because he lived by example. You know, he had this wandering ministry and seemed to affect people by as much his presence and their impact that they felt then as he wandered around and lived by example and so on. So there was something performative, we might say now, about it. And that feels, maybe it's got something to do with modern anarchy, which maybe Ruth will say more about. And also, in terms of his help with people, he did it spontaneously rather than institutionally. You know, Jesus is often remembered now for siding with the poor, helping the poor and the needy and so on. And I'm sure that happened. But he didn't do it by setting up food banks and great programs, let alone seeding something like the welfare state, but did it there and then. And there's something important about the spirit of that kind of help, I think, which fits more with an anarchist view. It's not about trying to create a bureaucracy, you know, useful and successful though that may or may not be. He's doing it from a different part of the human soul, you might say, in just giving what he had to those that were around him. So it's a very different kind of approach to the concern for others. And of course, he was rather, I think, anti-theology, in fact. He's remembered for saying things like the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, and upsetting religious figures. He claimed to have a very intimate relationship with the divine, not one mediated through, say, rituals, the establishment, institutions, and so on. Now, I haven't completely made this up. Some biblical scholars have said that he might have had links with the ancient Greek Cynics, and they were one of the ancient schools after Socrates in the Hellenistic period. And certainly by the time of Jesus, Cynic figures would have been seen all around the Mediterranean, including in Judea and near Nazareth, where Jesus taught. Nazareth is actually very near to a large Roman town in Jesus's day called Sepphoris. And there's good evidence, in fact, that the full Hellenistic richness and culture would have been there. So it's very likely that Jesus did meet the occasional roving cynic. And they were known for preaching, actually. They were known for, well, they invented the word diatribe. A fairly early cynic called Teles of Megara invented the word diatribe. And initially these were kind of, you chastise yourself. You'd say, why am I bothered with the goods of the world? when they don't really deliver me happiness? Why am I concerned about tomorrow and when today's got enough cares for itself? Why don't I look at the lilies of the field and the birds of the air? They're railed in great splendor. Why do I bother about the clothes I'm wearing? Now, the alert amongst you will have realized I've smuggled in Jesus's sayings there, but that's precisely because they feel quite diatribe-like, in fact. And so that will be a link with the Cynic. If those of you are into this, the biblical scholar John Dominic Crossan is the one who's explicitly made these links. And he also recognized that the kind of early iconography of Jesus fits quite nicely with the early iconography of the Cynics as well. They were sort of bearded, carried nothing much but a staff, that kind of thing. And so there's echoes there in the memory of Jesus too. Now, of course, that sense of Jesus is not much visible today in Christianity, certainly Western Christianity. Certainly in these islands from whence I speak, the UK, with the Church of England, you wouldn't think Cynic, you wouldn't think anarchist when you think Church of England. But there have been people associated with the anarchist group, and I know Tom and Ruth are going to talk about this shortly, but the obvious figure there is Leo Tolstoy, who's often associated with anarchism, and he took, I think, some of this thread and spirit from within the Christian tradition. And maybe there's other groups as well, like the Quakers. I'm not sure. Maybe there's some of you who would know that better if you make these associations yourself. And I even wonder, you know, when I think about my interest in this take on Jesus, whether it might make something of a comeback, because Christian institutions, certainly in the Anglo-American world, are in decline in one form or another. And yet the kind of religious impulse doesn't seem to be declining in the same way. Philosophers like Charles Taylor have said we actually live in a kind of supernova of spiritual interest in the modern world, which can feel quite chaotic and messy. But that makes opportunities for these kind of more prophetic figures to appear and make their interventions, to be engaged in the world, but in unconventional ways, as if we live in a time that's lost something really important, and they're trying to stand against that and stir something up in how they act as much as what they say. But hopefully Tom is back now, and some of you are at least interested in the idea that Jesus might have been a proto anarchist, and enjoyed a few thoughts there about the Cynics as well. Tom hasn't butted in and said thank you very much, Mark. That was absolutely fascinating. So I'm not even sure whether he's here.
I am here, and that was
very good.
Yeah, obviously I've heard it all before, but I'm sorry I cut out again. I don't know why that was. I had to kind of re-sign in again. You probably didn't catch the end of the Big Rock Candy Mountains, which is a shame because it's one of the great anarchist songs, really. In that they're dreaming of a world without work, without authority. Not only that, but what makes the Big Rock Candy Mountains such a brilliant song, it's actually based on the medieval idea of the land of cocaine, which was a sort of fun version of paradise. So medieval people were actually very sort of sensual and fun-loving, and they loved hanging around in big gangs and feasting and having a laugh and basically taking the piss out of people. And so paradise to them was an incredibly sort of boring place. There's no one to talk to. There's only two people. There's no fun, you know. So they invented this alternative sort of working man's paradise, if you like, called the land of cocaine, where there's free love, there's no private property, wine flows through the rivers, and no one has to do any work. And that's what the Big Rock Candy Mountain picked up on as an idea. It's also in George Orwell, it's an Animal Farm. This idea of the land of cocaine. But the great thing about Big Rock Candy Mountains is that there are authority figures in the song, police and so on. There are jails, but the police are sort of comically disabled. They have rubber legs, and the jails are made of tin, so you can just walk into the jail and walk straight out again. So they have these sort of completely pointless systems of incarceration that don't work at all. And these policemen who just sort of wobble around the place and unable to apprehend villains, which is it's a really good sort of spice to the sort of anarchist utopia, I think, that the Big Rock Candy Mountains describe. So sorry about that little, not a diatribe, but a sort of mini sermon or explanation. Ruth, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, Ruth Kinna, as you will have known, or you will have read or seen and know, is a distinguished professor of political economy at Loughborough, the author of several books about anarchism over the years, including this kind of rather essential tome, Great Anarchists. Essential not only because of the writing in it, but also the pictures, which are by Clifford Harper. So there's an example of a spread in true anarchist style, beautifully typeset and designed, with that great picture of Kropotkin, who we're going to come on to in a moment. Anarchism, Ruth, why did you get into this subject?
I came across the anarchists when I was at university. So I did an undergraduate degree in history and politics. And as someone who, I guess, in Thatcher's Britain, the early years of Thatcher's Britain, thought of themselves on the left, but couldn't quite find a left that I identified with. And I did a course in my second year on Spain, which was basically about the revolution and the Civil War. And that was the first time I came across the anarchist movement. And that sort of piqued my interest, I guess. And in my third year, my final year, I was very interested in anything to do with political thought. And in my final year, I did a course that was run by an anarchist, William Fishman. And the course was a sort of a history of revolution from the French to the Bolshevik Revolution, told from an anarchist perspective. And that's when I first came across Kropotkin, Bakunin, and all the rest of the cast. And because I was at Queen Mary in London, which was just down the road from the Freedom Press bookshop, I discovered very early on a really good source of anarchist literature, and I didn't stop after that.
And that's the bookshop that's behind Aldwych, isn't it?
It's Whitechapel.
Oh, sorry, Whitechapel.
Whitechapel, yeah. So in London, it's by the Whitechapel Art Gallery.
Yeah, and it's still there.
It's still there. It's been there since 1886.
Oh, fantastic.
Well, with a few moves, but yeah, it was set up originally in 1886.
Okay, well, let's go on to the difference between anarchism and socialism in a minute. But I mean, let's talk about the main question in anarchism, which is the one that everyone says, which is, I thought it was about smashing up bus stops and being violent. And we anarchists have to say, no, it's the opposite. What does the word actually mean? It's something like monarch means one ruler in Greek. Anarch means, I think, no ruler, or sometimes people translate it as against authority.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know that much about Greek, but my translation of it is the government of no one. So instead of the monarchy, the government of one, oligarchy, the government of the group, anarchy, the government of no one, and it means if no one governs, then we all govern, and we have to find ways of making decisions that we can all live with through our cooperation. And the anarchist says that's perfectly possible without somebody telling you what the rules are before you even start.
And it was Proudhon who first said, "I am an anarchist." And I think probably Johnny Rotten was quoting that line in Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols. So let's have a quick sketch of Proudhon before we move on to some of the other guys, because I think he was basically in the sort of pretty early sort of 1850s. Is that right?
So Proudhon published What is Property in 1840. And What is Property is the book where he asks the question, what is property, and gives the answer, it is theft. And it's the book that I suppose sort of marked the start of the anarchist movement as a self-described, as a positive movement. So before Proudhon, anarchism had been used in order to denigrate people, as it was a pejorative, in order to sort of to outlaw them. And Kropotkin took the title on to describe a program of action which depended, if you like, on the abolition of the exclusive right to ownership, which he said, if you give that right to people, then basically you make the possibility of ownership for everyone impossible, because only some people can actually own the property, and anyone who go on.
Well, he also said something, I think he also said property, the next line was something like property is freedom.
Yeah, so he distinguishes between two types of property. So there's property that exists as an exclusive right, so that I can own you know, 9/10 of the land, pass it on to whoever I like, and then they can own it, and the rest of you have nothing. And then he said there's property in use, whereby we can all use the land that exists in front of us and the resources that we have in common, and none of us can claim exclusive right in order to pass them on to other people. And that's the only way that we can own property in common.
Now, let's go on to the, I mean, two of the, in a way, most glamorous or at least attractive of the 19th century anarchists were probably Prince Kropotkin, who was a sort of aristocratic Russian who came to Bromley, Kent, in the late 19th century and influenced Oscar Wilde. And then, as Mark said, there's actually a anarchist tradition in Christianity, which picks up on some of the stuff that Mark was talking about. Actually, Christ was anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist, and perhaps the parables weren't even about, you know, just being kind to each other, which is one contemporary version of one contemporary interpretation of Christianity. And that figure was Tolstoy, who, I don't know if these two things went along. I mean, obviously, you know, most people just think of him as the great Russian author, the author of War and Peace and so on. But he wrote this other stuff, which was tracing a line through, I think he talks about the Quakers, certainly talks about pacifism and violence. And he says that as I remember, Ruth, and put me right here, he's essentially saying that the state is the source of all evil, you know, and that's an anarchist position. So we're brought up to think that the state protects us, it provides laws, it keeps us safe, and so on. But Tolstoy, through his Christianity and belief in Christ, is saying, actually, look at the state. The state is by nature violent. It's by nature coercive. It's by nature authoritarian, and therefore a good Christian is an anarchist who should resist that authority.
Right. There's a lot there, but I mean, let's start with Tolstoy. So I mean, Tolstoy is called a Christian anarchist, and Kropotkin is one of the people who calls him Christian anarchist. But I think it's slightly misleading in the sense that Tolstoy doesn't. I think it's probably more sense to say that he's a religious anarchist. So what he has to say about anarchism holds fast, he says, and Kropotkin agrees with him. He thinks that what Tolstoy has to say is as relevant to a Buddhist or a follower of Judaism or Islam or even a freethinker. So this isn't a Christian doctrine as such. It's a doctrine which understands that there is meaning in life that we can understand through our relationship to God. And that relationship is a relationship in which God is not love, but love is God. So he thinks, I think, in terms of the possibility of understanding the importance of our social relations with each other, the way in which we can live as human beings in sociability on the earth. That's something that we attain through our understanding that we're part of something greater, and that thing that is greater is God. So it doesn't have to be a Christian God, it's just God. And I think he equates that God with a concept of love. So his position is not, I mean, for me, his position is not that far apart from even the most rabid sort of anti-clerical anarchist, because, you know, Tolstoy, like the other anarchists of the 19th century, was also virulently opposed to the imposition of religion through clerical institutions. So, and he was excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church for preaching the kinds of doctrines that he had. And the argument that he had about the state, I mean, he calls it, you know, he calls it the slavery of our times. And he basically takes Proudhon's argument and says, you know, one of the things that we believe about the state wrongly is that the state is necessary for us, that without having something like the state, without having a kind of a leader, our affairs become chaotic. And so we look to a leader as someone who can control things for us, who can make things manageable. And basically, Tolstoy said this is a complete fiction. There's no one on earth who can control your life for you, who can control complex affairs. The only people who can do that are ourselves. And we have to do it through practices which are, as I say, sort of communal and based on a sort of an increasing understanding of our sort of relationship to something transcendental, if you like. And the reason that we think that the leader is necessary is because we're conned basically into practices which are basically exploitative, oppressive, and which sustain minorities at the cost of majorities. And they do that through, as you say, through militarization, through the exploitation of property and natural resources, and through providing material comforts for enough people to keep everybody pacified, and the promise of material comforts for those who don't have them. And he calls this hypnosis. You know, we're hypnotized into thinking that this is the only way to live. And actually, you know, the answer is to throw it all up in the air and withdraw from it and live in a completely different way. And that's, he realizes, I think, a really hard thing to do. And that's why you need to think of this process as a journey through which you become more and more understanding of what it is, what the priorities of life really are.
And to answer that, at roughly the same time, Kropotkin was actually very practical, wasn't he? I mean, he was editing magazines, writing, you know, actually sort of some quite boring technical stuff about how many acres of land there are in the UK, and you know how we could support ourselves through small farms and so on. But it's you know, people say anarchism is a sort of silly dream, but Kropotkin is actually, you know, packed with practical ideas.
Yeah, that's right. So Kropotkin's argument is that, you know, if we want to change the way in which we live, if we recognise that we live in societies which are unjust, unfair, resistant to change, and which basically use violence to keep people in line, then we have to think in terms of revolutionary transformation. But when we think of revolution, what we shouldn't do is make the mistake of thinking that the revolution is just this sort of event that happens when we all put up barricades and point guns at each other and then move from one condition into another. He says that's nonsense. That's not what revolution means. Revolution is about changing, again, our social relationships, and it requires enormous planning. You know, the way that you bring about the changes to the political decision-making structures that you have, the way in which you change your economy, is to start building those institutions now. And so one of the things that Kropotkin wanted to do, and this is why he gives all this practical advice, is to show that it's perfectly possible, for example, to make cities self-sufficient. You have to completely transform the economies of those cities, but you can do it. And we can all practice these kinds of this kind of economy collectively together, so that when, you know, crisis hits, if you like, we can support each other through hard times in order to drive revolutions forward, in order to meet the opposition that we are inevitably going to meet if we want to challenge the existing structures of power.
And Kropotkin is quite a fan of the medieval system, isn't he? The system of city-states.
Yeah, so one of the models of one of the historical models that he points to in order to show the possibility of self-government is the medieval city-state. So the city-states, I suppose, before their decline, I mean, the height of them is around the sort of 12th, 13th century. And he says, you know, if you look at these cities, you'll find that they had self-governing charters, they had local economies, which were very strong. Arts and culture flourished within them. The problem of the city-states was that they didn't include the peasantry beyond the city walls, and therefore they left themselves open to the exploitation of unscrupulous barons who eventually sowed dissent within the walls of the city and then started to sort of monopolize and centralize power within them. But the city-state, is a model of federation, if you like, and you can see similar kinds of ideas about political organization in some of our modern independence movements. I mean, there is an anarchist strain, at least within the Catalan movement, and it's based on a similar idea of cantonalism and federalism.
Now, let's talk about the difference between anarchism and socialism. There's an amazing bit of Lenin where I think he's talking about party literature. And he absolutely hated the anarchists. And he says, you know, anarchism is bourgeois individualism turned inside out. And you still hear that from, and on the other hand, the anarchists attack the sort of lefties, if you like, by calling them centralist trots, which I've always thought was a brilliant insult, because it's so sort of obscure, really, you know, all those centralist trots over there. Whereas Lenin at the same time saying that, you know, anarchists are just sort of like shopkeepers who are just like looking after their own little estate. They're not looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, again, you know, there's a I mean, the chart, I mean, let's start from the top. So for me, anarchists are socialists. So anarchists are fundamentally committed to communal ownership, and they're committed at the same time to changing the political institutions that we have in order to make collective ownership libertarian. That's the basis of the anarchist claim. So in that sense, you know, they're as socialist as any Marxist is, and I think there's clear blue water, if you like, between an anarchist and a so-called anarcho-capitalist who just wants to roll back the state in order to let people, some people, benefit massively in markets.
Yeah, there's a sort of libertarian and
yeah, what in America is called libertarianism. It means different things in America and Europe.
So you would call libertarianism what here?
Well, so in Europe, libertarian socialism is a way of expressing a desire for a non-party socialism, an anarchistic socialism. And the nub of the argument with the Leninists and the Marxists, if you like, is that Marxism requires socialists to adopt a particular program for change and to organize in particular ways which give power to a party on behalf of a class. And anarchists argue that although class exploitation is an enormous problem and one that has to be confronted, it's not the only form of cleavage that exists. There are also things like racism and patriarchy, which class cannot account for. And there is no single program which is going to resolve these kinds of issues. So anarchists want to say the best way of pushing through socialist change is to enable people to develop their own strategies autonomously in their local areas and to work collectively through federation rather than sign up to some universal program for emancipation whereby the rules or the criteria for freedom are determined in advance. For the anarchists, that's just another form of doctrinaire constraint.
Another form of authoritarianism.
Yeah.
So would you place Orwell as an anarchist?
I'm sort of leery of calling people anarchists who didn't call themselves anarchist. So I mean, Homage to Catalonia is one of the great defenses of the anarchists in the Republican zone in Barcelona in the Spanish Civil War. But Orwell went out there actually as a member of the POUM, which was denounced by the Stalinists as Trotskyist. And I think Orwell was someone who clearly his critique of authority and the critique of revolution that he puts in Animal Farm resonates very strongly with an anarchist view. I think it comes from a different kind of route. I mean, there is an argument that he's something that could be labelled a Tory anarchist, but some anarchists would dispute that label as meaningless. So I think one of the things I like about anarchism is that I don't think it's just for anarchists. I think actually what anarchism has to say about self-government and cooperation and our ability to make our own rules is not something that you have to be ideologically signed up to. It's something that you can think of as a sort of common sense. And to that extent, I think Orwell understood that too.
Yeah, and you can be an anarchist in everyday life without having to kind of sign up to a particular political party.
Yeah.
And it's quite an empowering thing, because it's like, it's punk. We do what we like, and also we look after each other. I mean, to me, that's the sort of two central tenets. And it's actually taking the good bits of Toryism, perhaps, which is, the focus on self-responsibility, individualism, and the very good bits of socialism, which is looking after each other, and combining them into one. So it seems to me like, it's an incredibly moderate, actually, philosophy, that someone who reads Aristotle, or a sort of moderate philosopher would embrace. How did it get so maligned? I mean, I know you talk about this in your book, and Joseph Conrad, the secret agent, the bomb throwing and stuff.
So I think the anarchists were, I mean, they were demonized from the start. I mean, before even an anarchist movement got going, and I think it's partly to do with the fact that anarchism becomes associated quite early on with some of the anti-Tsarist movements that come out of Russia. So although within Europe, certainly within Britain, there's some degree of sympathy for anti-Tsarism, for the nihilists, if you like, because Britain sees itself as the great champion of liberties and against autocracy. The assassination of the Tsar in 1881 sort of sent out a chill, I guess, across Europe, and suggested that there was this. I mean, it was called the terrorism. And it suggested that there were these groups of people who were, hell-bent, if you like, on regicide and just destroying all of the institutions that seemed to be good, and without having any proposals for any alternatives, and who weren't really strongly associated with a clear philosophy. So unlike Marx, who was also, I mean, absolutely demonized as the Red Doctor in the UK in the years of the Paris Commune in 1870 and 1871. I mean, there was some traction, at least, with Marx. There was some engagement with things like the Manifesto and Marx's writings, but you couldn't really put your finger on the same kind of body of work within anarchism. And the anarchists, I suppose, I mean, openly challenged every institutional belief that a liberal and a constitutionalist held dear, and basically argued that the great changes that have been brought into that have been realized through the 18th and 19th century revolution, so the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the great kind of enlightenment and liberation. And basically anarchists said, no, it's just autocracy in new clothes. And of course that was inexplicable, I think, for a lot of people. And that's the root of the problem. I think the other thing that you find in anarchism is that you have a number of very strong women within the anarchist movement. And they're not the only people, but they are vociferous campaigners against marriage, for birth control, for rights over their children. They're attacking the family. And if anything is going to frighten people in 19th century Europe, it's that kind of politics. And these, the fact that women are there in the movement, I think adds to the horror, if you like, that the anarchist is just there to destroy everything that we hold dear.
It is quite amazing that I think people forget that people like Louise Michel were hanging out with William Morris, as you say in the book. Louise Michel was one of the sort of prominent anarchists in this country. Emma Goldman was a big one in the States, I think. And it was turning everything upside down, and that was quite a long time ago. And this is supposed to be the period of, Edwardian England, late Victorian England, when we were all sort of squares. And then, of course, you think of the suffragettes, who were very, very violent, slightly later, but doing exactly the kinds of things that, I don't know, the anarchists of today, Extinction Rebellion, will be doing, gluing themselves to statues or whatever, weren't they?
Well, I mean, the suffragette. I mean, because the suffragette movement split on terrorism. But yeah, I mean, it was clearly a direct action movement. I mean, I suppose the advantage, although again, the suffragettes absolutely horrified the establishment. At least the establishment could understand the idea of wanting the vote. Whereas the anarchists were pointing fingers at the suffragettes and saying, yeah, we like the way you're doing it, we just don't like what you're asking for.
Now, this is a thorny issue in anarchist circles, isn't it, Ruth? Who do you vote for, or do you vote at all?
Yeah, it's become a thorny issue. I mean, I think, it came up again in the last election, whether anarchists, would participate in elections, and I think, some people do and some people don't. It's still, I don't think it's yeah, I mean, it's controversial. I think things like the Scottish referendum have made voting more attractive for some anarchists. Where you have the possibility of thinking about triggering a constitutional change that could be pushed in a particular direction, in an anarchist direction, then I think that makes voting more attractive. I think Brexit divided anarchists like it divided everybody else. And again, sort of the prospect of a massive sort of constitutional change was problematic. I think the more thorny, or the angrier arguments tend to be about the extent to which anybody thinks voting is going to fundamentally bring about social change. So, I mean, the argument about Jeremy Corbyn within the anarchist camp was about how reasonable it was to think that a Labour victory in the last UK election would actually result in any kind of substantial change. And I think you had the same argument being rehearsed in America over Bernie Sanders. And I think still for the majority of the anarchist movement, the answer to that is, that's a daft thing to expect. So whether or not you vote, you might have, strategic or practical reasons for voting. The expectation is not that the program is going to make a difference.
So you might be saying something with your vote, or communicating something, perhaps just to yourself or to friends, or expressing some sort of a hope, but you don't really harbour any kind of serious faith that things are going to suddenly overnight change in the favour of the people, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it depends where you're situated, in what kind of constituency you're situated. But I mean, the other thing I suppose about the last election is that, I mean, there was an anarchist class war contestation of the election, which was a way of drawing attention to a whole range of issues in London about housing and about property development, and putting up buildings that have separate entrances for the main residents, and then the back entrance for the
poor doors.
Yeah, the poor doors campaign.
Yeah, was that Ian Bone and his poor doors?
That's right. So
and he's got a sense of humour. I mean, he makes a point, and he's not obviously going to get elected, but he gets a bit of. But sorry, we better move on to questions. I just realised that I've been sort of like rambling on. But yeah, just to conclude that's kind of the Ian Bone class war idea of anarchism and action as a sort of form of education, I suppose.
That's right, and propaganda. Yeah, and just stirring things up a bit in some constituencies where there were sitting MPs, and particularly Tory MPs, that class war found particularly objectionable.
Ruth, thanks so much. Victoria, do we have some questions from our audience?
We've got loads of questions, and I'm going to ask Doris Parry to ask her yours. Ask hers first. Ask you, Doris. Would you ask your question? And I think hopefully the answer to this, Doris and everybody, might be the answer to some other questions, because there are two big themes in the questions. One is who does it well, and the other one is how can we do it ourselves personally. But let's start with Doris.
Well,
Doris.
Thank you very much, Professor, for having corrected my understanding of anarchism. anarchism. And I'm supposed to be educated, shame on me. So I don't know how many of us tonight sort of the penny drop or what. But listening to you, especially when you talked about Catalonia and perhaps the British politics and all that, I wonder if you know or you have an opinion about the global situation, all the political systems, all the different regimes, whether they call it democracy or social democracy or whatever. Which one would you say is the closest to the best ideals of anarchism?
So that's a really, thank you. That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think there's a, I mean, I think that one of the arguments that's sometimes put against anarchists is that because they're opposed to authority and because they reject the state, they can't distinguish between types of state. And I think that's not correct. And I think anarchists have always recognized that, you know, if you had a choice, then it would be better to live in a regime that had rights and some, you know, sort of defenses, liberal civil liberties than one that didn't. So from that point of view, you know, you could classify states in terms of their civil liberties, and you can classify progressive change in terms of the expression that it gives. So a lot of anarchists are out there protesting about the criminal justice bill on that basis, that this is going to be a constraint on our liberties, and that's a regressive move, that's a negative move, and something that should be resisted.
And would you
But
say
I think
Nordic, sorry to interrupt you.
No, go on.
The Nordic countries would be closest in this?
Well, I think having,
measure?
yeah, so I think there's a difference between saying it's possible to differentiate between a liberal and a less liberal state, and saying that a liberal state therefore is like anarchy. And I think actually the anarchist would say, no, a liberal state is not like anarchy, because a liberal state is still telling you what the rules are and telling you to conform. And not only that, is serving the interests of capitalism and perpetuating patriarchy and racism and all these other things. And so that the better models of anarchy or anarchistic practice come from within those states, if you like. So, for example, you can look at cooperative movements. I mean, there's a movement in the UK called Radical Roots, which is a housing and workers co-op, which is linked to, you know, a global cooperative movement, and which actively operates to decommodify property, take it off the market, and enable people to live as owners and tenants in collectively run homes. That's a kind of an anarchy in action, and you can imagine the possibility of that kind of model spreading, because it does so within the framework of the existing laws of cooperation, but it gives it an anarchist slant, and in giving it an anarchist slant, it provides a model that can be replicated in other anarchistic ways.
Can you talk a bit about Rojava, Ruth? I mean, that's an amazing story.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not close to the detail of Rojava, but I mean, it's so one of the things that happened in the course of the Syrian war was that in northern Syria, I mean, a revolution took place which was led by groups within, or that were formerly Turkish communists, but who had undergone a sort of an anarchistic shift, if you like, in their thinking. So their leader, Abdullah Öcalan, had come across the writings of a well-known American, now dead, anarchist, or sometime anarchist, Murray Bookchin. He was an ecological anarchist. And they've pursued against ISIS, and at some point, or in the early years, I guess, with some American backing, they've pursued an experiment, a revolutionary experiment in decentralized federation, which cuts across ethnic boundaries, which advances feminist goals. It's a strongly feminist movement, and which has become a kind of for anarchists. I mean, it's been compared to the Spanish Revolution of 36 to 39. in terms of its success, if you like, in managing to establish new constitutional, anarchistic, decentralized regimes, self-governing regimes. And you should, I mean, if you want to find out more, the person to read is the journalist Debbie Bookchin, who's done a huge amount of work in Rojava and has talked at length. There's a long article in the New York Times, which unfortunately is behind a paywall, I think, but if you can get hold of it, it's a fantastic investigation or analysis of Rojava and the role of anarchism within it.
So is she related to Murray Bookchin?
She's the daughter of Murray Bookchin.
Really? That's amazing. So she's the daughter, and she's gone out there and written about the actual practical effect of his teachings and where they've been taken up. I mean, it's an amazing story. Vic, have you got any more?
Yes, absolutely. Maybe we'll go straight to Alex Irish, because lots of people have asked about the practical side, maybe, and this is about this country, isn't it, Alex? Could you ask your question?
Hi, I just wanted to ask Victoria whether she thought that an anarchist society could be reached through peaceful or electoral means as opposed to some sort of like uprising or revolution, and whether that can be achieved in this country.
That's a question for Ruth, Alex, not me. I couldn't possibly answer it.
Oh, sorry, yeah, for Ruth. Yeah, sorry,
brilliant question. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. Hi, Alex. Thanks for the question. So, I don't see. I suppose that for me, the model of anarchist change is not the event. So we don't move from state to anarchy. We can only progressively extend anarchy through the way in which we organise our affairs and the ways in which we run our institutions, basically. So, I mean, I mean, the question really is, can anarchy work through peaceful means? Anarchy does work through peaceful means. The problem that the anarchist tends to face is that the successful anarchist experiments tend to get shut down by force. And then the question is, well, are you going to resist, and how are you going to resist? And anarchists divide on that. There's no clear answer, and there's no definite policy. It's a matter of your self-determination, because the consequences of that decision are massive for individuals, and so individuals have to decide that. But can I imagine anarchy being voted in? No, I can't. I mean, anarchism is not something that works according to a manifesto. Anarchy is something that works according to the rules that people make within their localities, and those localities can be complex and plural. So I might be a member of many different kinds of clubs and associations, many different kinds of institutions. Some of them will be geographically local and concentrated where I live, and others will be remote and global. And the way in which we as groups organize those groups and the practices of those groups, that's the practice of anarchy.
Great, thank you. That's probably much more you could follow on with that. But could I ask Sarah Sanderson to ask her question? We'll speed on. Sarah.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I appreciate, Ruth, that you've got a real broad spectrum of people here this evening, and that knowledge base is huge. So I'm coming at this from a small knowledge base. But the bit I'm really struggling with to kind of, when I'm trying to fit it with, the small life that we have to the bigger life, to the world, is what is successful anarchy? And so you just used that expression just now, and I'm just trying to work out what that is and where it is.
So for me, the success of anarchy is our ability to maintain self-government and to practice what Kropotkin called mutual aid. So I mean, it's interesting that one of the things that the COVID pandemic has thrown up within days of the lockdowns coming into force, you saw the mushrooming of what were called mutual aid groups, and a network of mutual aid groups whereby these weren't all anarchists by any means, but anarchists were involved in them, and they weren't just in this country. I mean, there were a lot of mutual aid groups in America too. But basically, it was the capacity of people to come together and decide that they were going to take food to health workers, make PPE for health workers, check on neighbours, make sure people weren't getting without their medicines. Small acts of kindness, if you like, of non-reciprocal giving. That's an exercise of mutual aid in action, and it's the basis on which Kropotkin would tell us we should start institutionalizing. What kinds of institutions and organizations can we create that enable us to do this for the longest possible time with the greatest flexibility? And that's and there's no magic bullet to that. There's no litmus test for that. It's just the way in which you can practice those kinds of cooperative behaviors voluntarily by your own initiative and in collaboration with others.
One example that's often given is lifeboats, isn't it, Ruth?
Yeah, lifeboats. Yeah, the Lifeboat Association was one of Kropotkin's favorite examples. So this was I mean, it was set up initially. I mean, the ambition for it was global, but the idea was that you didn't need a central authority to start patrolling the coasts. Actually, the way that the Lifeboat Association worked was by volunteers coming together and deciding that it was simply unconscionable to allow people to drown at sea. And that's how it works now, and it's funded voluntarily.
So, Joe Downey,
what was called the Black Cross in order to support prisoners.
So just on that, it sounds to me as if anarchism has to be in a small state or a small movement or small groups. I've got a question from Joe Downey, who can't ask it herself, or himself actually, Joe. But she wondered whether the Mayor of Manchester, whether these sort of small power groups are beginning to emerge, and whether Andy Burnham of Manchester might be an example of anarchism, or is that sort of completely a different type of power?
So I think you're right. Anarchism works best in small groups, but I suppose the point the anarchist wants to make is that those groups can cooperate with each other and collaborate, and you can build global networks, just as you do. We have global networks. How do scientists talk to each other to exchange information about vaccines? They have global networks, and these are organized by groups of people who have shared interests. So you can federate and you can collaborate over wide geographic areas, even though you're in a small group, and it just as the cooperative movement does. So you get the member co-ops are small, but they're part of global organizations. So these things build from the bottom up. So on the constitutional things, I mean, from my point of view, I mean, the idea that we now have mayoral authorities and we have a sense of devolved power is potentially a positive thing, because it sets up the possibility, or it establishes the possibility, that people in Manchester might have different priorities, different needs, and different ways of organizing themselves to people in, Westminster, or, why the hell should Westminster lay down all the rules? I think there are other examples that you could point to think about community organizing as opposed to the traditional kind of mayoral structure. So although we now have a metropolitan area, we still have the mayor, and we still have this kind of top-down decision-making and traditional notions of power, if you like. But I mean, there are experiments in Preston, for example, where you've got community-led projects which are bringing people together to invest in local projects and pool resources in order to benefit the least well off, if you like. So they're democratic, and that they practice a much more kind of consensual model of decision making than majoritarianism. So I think these kinds of examples are really powerful and can always be pushed in more anarchistic directions. But I think, yeah, the move towards local decision making is generally, in my view, a good thing.
Great. I hope that I'm sure that makes Joe very happy. I'm going to just squeeze in one more question. I think it will mean we go over a minute, but could we have Pippa Marriott, please? Pippa.
Yes, hello there. Hi.
Hiya.
Yeah, Ruth, count me in. I'm ready. What do we do next? What am I doing tomorrow? How do we bring this on? What am I doing in my community?
What do you do at the moment?
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to answer that, but I think
yeah.
so. The basis of the answer has to come from what you already do.
Yeah. Rather
than try and invent some new set of practices that are going to result in burnout, disillusionment, exhaustion. So, you know, what is it that you do in your everyday life that you could do differently? You know, what can I do in my workplace that changes the dynamic of teaching? You know, there's so much bureaucracy in university systems, and you know, it's really difficult sometimes to think of different ways of doing things. But you know, we can involve our students differently in the way that we teach, in the way that we talk to them, in the way that we give feedback. You know, there are all kinds of things, little things. Start with the little things, and then start talking to people about the little things would be my advice. And go online. There's a vast amount of really fantastic information about anarchism and anarchists and you know, anarchist experiments, anarchist information, newspapers, file sharing.
What's your top one then, Ruth? If I go online now, what am I Googling?
Oh, my top site. Oh, that's really stuffed me. Libcom is a really good place to start, actually. Libcom. It's got lots of historic information, lots of contemporary information, and there's also a long kind of list, a kind of blog roll, if you like, so it would put you in touch with a lot of other sites. There's an anarcho-feminist library, which is great.
And don't forget to download my own anarchist manifesto from my book, How to Be Free. That's on the Idler website, and that gives lots of ideas like bake bread, open the village hall, and the most important one is buy an Idler t-shirt. That's something we can all do now to help our communities. I mean, help me and Vic.
On that note, we are going to have to say goodbye to you, Ruth. We could have gone on so much longer. Thank you so very much for sharing a bit of your knowledge. And everybody, I'll send the link to Ruth's books because there's a lot more to read. And there you go. There's one of them.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely brilliant.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Bravo, bravo.
Thank you.